Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about another Halloween-themed album, an album that really just kind of gets me into the spooky mood for my personal favorite time of year, Halloween time. And last time I talked about the Misfits' classic punk album Walk Among Us, an exercise in super campy Ed Wood-esque horror punk, and a founding record of that entire subgenre. But after that album, despite how much I love it, I was still looking for something a bit more serious and straightforward in terms of disturbing qualities, Halloween-esque qualities, and general grotesqueness. Enter Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' Murder Ballads. Released in 1996, Murder Ballads is a big fan favorite within the Nick Cave fan base, and I should know because I'm an obnoxiously big Nick Cave fan. Murder Ballads is also arguably the album that has since defined his career and set the standard for his songwriting, or at least how the public views his songwriting. You could definitely argue that albums prior to this one, like Let Love In, which had his signature song Red Right Hand, or even records before that like Henry's Dream and The Good Son and Tender Prey, even the other signature song The Mercy Seat being found on Tender Prey, all kind of led up to a sort of self-definition in terms of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' place in the realm of gothic rock. But Murder Ballads is really the album that kind of put them on the map from a commercial standpoint and exposed them to a much wider audience. Now, before I actually talk about this album in depth, I'm gonna get one thing out of the way. I don't think this is a perfect album, and there's one main reason for that. I don't like Stagger Lee. I know it's a fan favorite song, it's one of the most well-loved songs not only on Murder Ballads but from the entirety of the Bad Seeds' career, but I just don't think it's a particularly good track. In fact, I actually think it's kind of bad. I find that it tries much too hard to be edgy and sort of disturbing with the graphic content of the lyrics, both in terms of imagery and profanity, and well, trust me, I have no problem with either of those in my music. It just doesn't work on Stagger Lee. It doesn't capture the same paranoid feel that the rest of Murder Ballads manages to maintain, and overall it just ultimately leaves the second track on the album kind of feeling out of place and resulting in a slightly disjointed beginning, especially after a godlike opener. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Stagger Lee, not a fan of it, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you're listening to this album in full, in which case it's there. The instrumental is kind of boring, it feels kind of forced in terms of actual edginess and disturbing content, and so on and so forth. I digress. That's the only bad track on this album. I adore everything else. One of the big things to note about Murder Ballads is that this was Nick Cave himself delivering some of the most interesting, engaging, and direct lyricism of his entire career, which is somewhat ironic considering he's technically telling relatively the same story throughout the entire album from song to song, as he successfully recreates the concept of a murder ballad from track to track, whether it's the sweeping epics of the paranoid and uncomfortable opener Song of Joy to the gruesome epic of O'Malley's Bar, and the more subtle tracks as well, like the somewhat more traditionalist The Kindness of Strangers, as well as the revenge tale Crow Jane. Overall, he really does take the murder ballad to about every corner that it can possibly go to, and you have to commend him for that. Cave's lyricism here is witty and sharp, but it's also disturbing and at times genuinely unsettling, really balancing this nice nature between self-aware humor and just genuine horror storytelling, which is really brilliant to hear overall, as this is the kind of concept that can be easily taken too seriously and become comedic accidentally, but rather there are songs here like The Curse of Millhaven that are purposefully comedic at times, and that's really the best direction that the Bad Seeds could have gone in here, and thank God that they did. If the world didn't think that Nick Cave himself was the crown prince of all things morbid in the singer-songwriter world before Murder Ballads came out, with his prior releases with the Bad Seeds and with The Birthday Party and even with The Boys Next Door, then Murder Ballads certainly drove that point home. Unfortunately, due to the fact that this is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, a lot of the members of the Bad Seeds that aren't Cave himself get overlooked even by the Nick Cave fanbase itself, and that includes the multi-instrumentalist Mick Harvey, who really ultimately defines the record a lot of the time. A lot of his key work, a lot of his organ work is generally something that not only supports, but really lays a sort of base work for a lot of these songs here in terms of structure. I mean, look at his work on The Curse of Millhaven. There wouldn't be anything nearly as theatrical about that record if it weren't for his organ playing. Martin P. Casey's bass work is underrated, as is Blixa Bargeld's guitar work, and generally speaking, the Bad Seeds just don't get enough credit for really ultimately just being one of the most important backing bands to possibly have. A backing band that knows how to structure a song while not necessarily overshining the primary factor of this band, of course, that factor being Nick Cave, his performance style, and songwriting. But at the same time, the Bad Seeds would not be the Bad Seeds without every other member that wasn't Nick himself. Now look, don't get me wrong, this is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds for a reason. Nick Cave's songwriting, his vocals that are so distinct, a sort of walk between Frank Sinatra and Satan. It really is his band, don't get me wrong. The band would not be nearly as good without Nick Cave if they had a different vocalist and primary songwriter. And with that being said, the Bad Seeds are still one of the tightest bands to ever really walk upon this side of disturbing alternative rock, and they don't get enough praise, don't get enough credit, and they don't get enough love in general. So if you have heard this album before and you didn't really take note of the instrumentals, I really suggest listening to it again, maybe a second time, just to really take in all of the instrumental work here that goes on in the background. It doesn't necessarily step into the limelight very often, because even besides Cave himself, there are some astoundingly talented musicians within the Bad Seeds, especially in this lineup in the mid-90s. The collaborations here are also pretty brilliant overall. PJ Harvey's work on the duet Henry Lee is absolutely amazing and intense, actually. It still holds up to this day in terms of intensity, though maybe that's to be expected considering Cave and Harvey were actually romantically involved back in the day, and I mean, not long after this album came out, The Boatman's Call would come out from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, which would be directly about the rise and fall of Cave and Harvey's relationship, so maybe that intensity is to be expected, but still, it's there and it's mind-blowing every single time. On the other hand, you have Kylie Minogue's appearance on Where the Wild Roses Grow, which, I mean, if that didn't prove to Nick Cave fans that Kylie Minogue was more than just your average pop star of the time, then I'm pretty sure nothing will, because it's truly one of the most gorgeous and tragic songs to come out of the 90s alternative scene. The final track on the album is a Bob Dylan cover, Death Is Not the End, and that doesn't necessarily seem like the most promising way to wrap up an album full of mostly originals, or at least rewrites of not original concepts, but really, Death Is Not the End is also a major highlight on the album, as it features not only Cave himself, but a variety of other musicians that were found on the album at different points. PJ Harvey, Kylie Minogue, and even Anita Lane, who is an incredibly underrated musician and a frequent collaborator of Cave himself, and a previous romantic partner of Cave himself, I believe, that also appears on that song. Really, Death Is Not the End is a beautiful way to wrap things up, as it has an amazing melody, and it's the ultimate collaboration. So, overall, Murder Ballads is just one of those albums that's kind of perfect for the Halloween season. I mean, it's goofy and campy to some extent, but it's also genuinely unnerving and frightening at times as well. I mean, listen to Song of Joy for the first time if you haven't, and tell me that doesn't set you off kilter at least a little bit. And look, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds had amazing albums before this. In fact, my favorite Nick Cave album is most likely Let Love In, which actually came out before Murder Ballads did. It was the preceding album to this record, but I don't think any Nick Cave album across any of his many projects quite captures this frightening, disturbing Halloween horror show kind of feel that Murder Ballads does, as he beautifully reinvents the very concept of a murder ballad, perhaps more than any other artist has in modern history. But the most important thing here is that this is the record that really did cement the Bad Seeds as one of the greatest alternative bands of the 20th century, and I mean, let's face it, even into the 21st century a bit as well. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.